If you're just getting into the mechanical keyboard space, most likely you're used to this: the Cherry MX and the MX clone switches. But beyond MX, there are so much more. One of those alternatives is the Topre. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Scott K. While most of the market is pretty much the standard mechanical Cherry MX switch and its variants, a Japanese company called Topre offers a very different type of switch for a very different type of typing experience. It's this, the Topre Electro Capacitive switch. While some of us may think that Topre is essentially just a standard membrane kind of switch, you have to kind of see them as a hybrid. It has both the membrane as well as some mechanical components to it. Usually Topre switches come pre-assembled, right? Like into pre-built keyboards, like the actual Topre Real Force, or Topre alternatives like the NIS keyboards. However, this time, we finally get a true custom keyboard with the option to go with a Topre style setup over the standard Cherry MX. I call it Topre Style because it's not from the actual Topre company, and this version uses an MX style stem for keycap compatibility. But just because you have that option, should you take it? Well, let's find out. So the keyboard we have in question is the Class 60 by Studio. If you recall, I made the most obnoxiously loud keyboard with the Class 80 before. The interesting thing about this keyboard is that it can be had in both the standard Cherry MX style or the Topre style EC switch. I'm going to actually attempt to show you both of the variants, so let's get through this as quickly as we can. Before we jump in though, I can tell you that this keyboard is not so much for the mechanical noob. There's so much going on with this thing, and especially if you decide to go with the Topre style, it's a fairly complicated build process. So keep that in mind before jumping right into the group pie, okay? This is a more advanced keyboard. So before we go into like the variations, we're going to look at the things that don't change even when you're going between the MX or the Topre style. Like, for example, the case. The case I have is this beautiful blue and black version. The ano on this is perfect and has this very retro keyboard look with a huge chin and a huge forehead. It also has this very aggressively chonky body, similar to how older keyboards, computers, and even gaming consoles were. It features a hidden screw design where the screws are like hidden into the rubber feet that's like below. And finally, it also has a very nice steel badge that says Class 60 right on the upper left corner. While from the outside, the case may seem pretty ordinary, things definitely change as you look at the details, alright? First of all, the Class 60 features a double weighted kind of system. You have a smaller gold weight on the inside, while the bottom of the case takes a much bigger, different steel weight. The version I have is black and it fits into the lower grooves just like this. It adds a lot of heft and also helps to tone down some of the case ping that you may experience. Once you pop the case open, you get greeted by this. What is this craziness that is going on here? Well, you have this extra large crevice to host a few interesting aspects of this keyboard. Firstly, the buzzer, and secondly, the solenoid. Why the heck does this keyboard have a buzzer, and what the heck is a solenoid? If you recall from the previous Class 80 video I did before, the buzzer makes a beep noise upon key press, and the solenoid is a mechanical device that makes a little tapping noise and also haptic feedback. Do all keyboards have it? No. Why does the Class 60 have it? Well, either you love the audible or the force feedback, or you're trying to do your best to get fired from work. Impossible! Now, as you get deeper in, you are greeted by more uniqueness. Unlike the Class 80, the Class 60 is a leaf spring mounted keyboard. It still has the ability to be like top mounted, just like the Class 80 did, but the leaf spring mount is what makes this keyboard even more interesting. You have the option of like going with the softer copper leaves or the stiffer steel ones. These leaves are mounted like right onto the lower case like this, and there are like 8 of them to hold the entire plate and PCB assembly up. You also put these like little rubber nipple things on the ends in order to provide additional cushioning for the PCB assembly. If you do decide to go with a leaf spring mount, this keyboard can actually be PCB mounted and skip the plate altogether. And as you can expect, the effect is pretty dramatic. This is a very bouncy and springy keyboard, as you would expect from a spring mount, right? As with most keyboards these days, the Class 60 comes with foam. Some exorbitant amount of foam actually. You got the thin lowercase foam, then you got the thick lowercase foam, then you got the under PCB foam, then you got the thin plate foam, then you got the thick plate foam, then you got the IXPE foam. Honestly, if you're going with like a leaf spring mount, none of this is needed. If you recall, I believe I kinda showed this with the previous Type 65 video before, that it seems like spring mount inherently eliminates the pinging and hollowness of keyboards very well. I believe it achieves this by providing an excellent isolation ability versus some of the other mounting styles. Now, let's get into the variations. So for the first look, we're going to start with the standard MX PCB. So if you take a look at the MX PCB, you have a very familiar sight. You got a standard 1.6mm thick PCB with no flex cuts, no RGB, and no nonsense. You do have the Gateron like hot swap sockets below for easy swapping, and it does come with multiple layouts even as a hot swap. Going on to the plate, it's a fairly standard FR4 plate finished in black and gold surrounds. The plate is also devoid of any flex cuts because, well, you got the springs underneath, you don't really need anything else. The plate also features little screw tabs in case you want to do top mounting instead of the spring mounts. So if you go with the spring mounting, it mounts to the PCB, while if you go with the top mounting, it mounts to the plate. So keep that in mind. But before we go on to the build itself, let's go to a quick word from our sponsor today, PCBWay. PCBWay is an online service that helps you print PCBs, do 3D printing, or even CNC machining. If you're an aspiring keyboard designer or whatever else designer, you can take your design and simply upload it to get something made quick. Or, if you have the source code for a PCB that you already have and you need a replacement, you can also get that done as well. They can handle all types of PCBs from your simple single layer designs to multi-layer stacks. Beyond PCBs, if you want to try making your own case, PCBWay can machine that as well. Now, a very exciting new service that PCBWay offers, OEM. Instead of just making a single component, you can actually task PCBWay to be an OEM manufacturer and make the whole thing. They can do anything from PCBs to CNC cases to even assembly. And using global manufacturing, they can offer very competitive prices. Is there a keyboard on the horizon? Well, check out OEM at PCBWay. The first build we'll be doing is the leaf spring mount build. So for this, you can see that the leaf spring's set up like below like this, right? To make things easier, insert the rubber mount into the spring before screwing the springs down into the case. It's so much easier, trust me on this. For this build, I will also be using a set of Dangkeebs and Tecsee banana milk linears. These are like linears with the PME housing to create a delightfully creamy Thock, as the vendor says. So let's see how they actually work, right? Since they come lightly lubed, I will actually try using them stock without going through the hassle of actually hand lubing them myself. If you're going with the spring, right, you don't need any foam honestly. However, I am using just a thin plate foam just to help like keep the plate up and make the switch install easier. I'm not really doing it for the sound modification honestly, but for stabs, I am using the Keyboard Staebies, right, Staebies. This is how everything looks complete. Now all of this is just placed on top of like the spring assembly and it just kind of floats. And yes, very bouncy overall with the spring holding up the PCB and plate. As mentioned before, you also have all this going on back here with like the buzzer and the solenoid and the 2 ribbon cables that needs to be installed. It can be a little daunting with all of this stuff going on, so keep that in mind. If this is like, you know, a little bit challenging, maybe this is a keyboard that's a little bit more advanced, right? So now the upper case gets put on, and this is how the keyboard looks like complete. For keycaps, I decided to go with a set of PBT Fans Deep Sea Predator since I felt that blue matched very well with the case of the Class 60 I have. Overall, it's a very nice and retro look. If that's like what you're looking for, right? This is what it is. It definitely is a chunky boy, so keep that in mind if you're interested in the Class 60. But I like how it turned out, so you know what? As you expected, yes, this thing is bouncy. Pretty much anywhere you press it, it's a bouncy all around and pretty even bounce also. So hey, if that's what you're looking for, this is great for that. And a side note, you can also opt for the matching wrist rest that actually sticks to the keyboard via the magnets in the front. Not sure why they sent me a black one, but for me, I don't really like metal wrist rests because it feels cold, but you know, preference once again. Now let's take this for a spin. As mentioned before, spring-mounted keyboards do a great job of isolating the plate on the PCB and greatly reduces the ping and hollowness of other style of keyboard mounts. With that said, Class 80 in this configuration sounds very safe and ordinary, with nothing really standing out in like good or bad ways. It's like kind of like middle of the ground. What happens though if you like top mount this thing instead, right? So let's take that for a spin. As expected, when you top mount this board, it sounds much more vibrant. It also exhibits the standard top mounted kind of sound with a little bit more depth and a little bit of hollowness versus like the spring mount was actually showing. It has a bit more character in this way versus the leaf spring in my opinion. So the reason why you even came to see this video, what happens if you go Topre style with this keyboard? But before we do that, what is Topre and how does it even work? If you look at a standard MX switch, it has a stem that goes up and down and triggers contact when it pushes against the leaf, making them touch together and registering a key press. When it comes to the Topre style, it works completely different. It's called Electro Capacitive switch because there's an electro capacitive sensor. How this kind of switch works is that there is an electro capacitive sensor that emits an electric field from the PCB, and when a foreign object enters the field and disrupts it, it can detect this and register this as a key press. The spring inside is what disrupts that field, triggering the press. The benefit of the switch is that it can be very quick to register since it doesn't require like a mechanical contact, right? There's like no debounce delay and stuff like that. Even the slightest touch can actually trigger a key press. Plus, it delivers a very distinct type of feel since the rubber dome collapses, creating a unique type of tactility that usually doesn't come from like the standard Cherry MX style stems. Many people actually say that the Topres are like silky smooth in terms of their tactility, but it's all a matter of preference. You know, you either like that or you like the standard MX tactility. So now with that educational bit out of the way, let's take a look at how this works in this keyboard. First of all, the PCB is completely different. It's pretty much bare, it's like flat. There is no sockets or anything like that since this is an electrocapacitive PCB. The nice thing is that this PCB is also configurable with vial. The plate looks similar to like a standard MX plate, but you can see that the plate itself has all these little screw sockets and nubs for the screws to catch onto. And you probably noticed that it goes the other way. Now the actual Topre style components. There are quite a bit of them actually, so take a look. So the first thing you got is the housing itself. Unlike an MX switch housing, the Topre styled one is just like half of a housing. The other half is essentially butting up against the PCB itself. Then you got the stems, right? The top of this Topre style variation has the cross like the MX style so that it could accept standard MX style keycaps. Note that the original Topre actually has a very different style of stem. Then you got the dome itself. As you can see, it collapses down as you put some pressure on it like this with your fingers. And finally, the springs. So the springs aren't really there to provide support or resistance, but rather this is what triggers the sensor. So how does all of this work then? Well, let's get started by lubing the thing. And yes, you can and should lube Topre style switches as well. You just take one and lube the corners of the housing where the stems will be sliding against. It's actually much less work versus an MX switch in this case because it's only one component you're really lubing. But don't go crazy with the lube. It'll gum it up and make the switch feel even more sluggish, so that's something that I don't recommend. Here's where things get weird, like really weird. Instead of lubing the springs like for an MX switch, for a Topre style board, you lube the PCB. Yes, the PCB. You grab some Krytox 205 and you can either use a brush or your fingers and paint a light coat over the PCB itself. This is like to help with the spring crunch. I hear that some people actually lube the spring with some Krytox 105, but conventionally this was advised against since it can, I guess, mess with the overall sensing. So PCB board lubing works just fine. I know that sounds just so weird even saying it. Now, to assemble all of this, everything works backwards on a Topre style keyboard. So you start by snapping in the housings onto the plate first. Once you finish snapping all the housing into the plate, then you can flip the whole entire thing upside down. Then you drop the stems into the housings one by one. It takes a bit of time. Once you get them all in, you can move on to the next steps. You drop the dome in next. One thing to note is that the dome doesn't come pre-cut out for the whole entire thing. The alphas, yes, but the rest, you can actually cut them out individually and drop them in one by one into the housing. Finally, you can get the springs and drop them into the domes as well. Remember not to get more than one spring into the dome, just one spring. This is a very tedious process since the springs tend to stack and snag against each other sometimes. It's kind of a pain. Now that you have everything in, you put the actual PCB onto the entire assembly on the top like this and screw it down with the many screws provided. Remember not to go too crazy when tightening this. You may end up snapping the PCB, so take some caution here. There you have it. This is the reason why I said this board, especially in Topre form, is not for a beginner. Putting the entire thing together takes quite a bit of time. Lubing to stacking, all of that stuff. And if you actually flip it over, you have to start the whole entire thing over again, so be careful. Once the entire assembly is complete, you can put into the keyboard as you have done with the MX style before. Then, put the case back on and this is what it looks like. The stabilizers I received with this sample specifically were actually Co-Star, but the actual production would be standard Cherry style. So nothing wrong with Co-Star, but lots more options for MX, so in my opinion it's a good thing. For this build, I wanted to go with a very OG kind of setup and look, so I decided to go with a set of MT3 white on black keycaps. The set completes the retro look very well, and I'm always a sucker for that blue and black combination on the keyboard, so what do you think? I think it turned out nice. It has a very unique look to it. Now, the moment you all have been waiting for. How does it sound? Well, let's find out. What do you think? For me, I always thought that Topre switches sounded kind of like a louder MX silent switch. Some people also say it sounds like a dog eating, maybe? My Topres actually have the silencing ring on the stem to tame the upstroke, so it is a bit more silent, but if you remove the rings, it could also become fairly loud. That is totally up to you, whether you want it more silent or louder. So after all this, what is my final thought? I think if you grab this keyboard, I would think that you would go for its ability to go Topre style. Honestly, I believe this is one of the few, if not the only, current custom mechanical keyboard that can accept something other than a Cherry MX switch. In addition, the modified stem allows for the compatibility with any MX style keycap, which is an absolute plus over the standard Topre. For that, it is a very unique piece and definitely earns a spot on my desk at least. Besides the Topre style EC switches, it also has a lot of the latest keyboard technology like the leaf spring mounting, the vial customization, and so on. In addition, it also features the buzzer and solenoid, which makes it very unique as well. Given all that is going on, I was actually surprised that this keyboard will actually start at $250. If you throw in the Topre style EC board into it, it raises the price by another $100 or so, making it around $350 US. Given the uniqueness of this keyboard, I would say that's not too bad. I've seen more expensive keyboards that have less features. Before I leave you, there is a typing test of the Class 60 with both the buzzer and solenoid enabled, right? You can just imagine. Enjoy, and thank you for watching.